The morning Alina Voss signed away her future, she was smiling. Her father stood beside her, his hands clasped behind his back, his breathing shallow and uneven, the breathing of a man who had not slept in 3 days. The Duke of Ashford sat across the table, his expression carved from something colder than stone, his eyes moving over the contract with the detached efficiency of a man reviewing a land deed. Which, Alina supposed, was precisely what this was. The solicitor cleared his throat, slid the paper toward her, offered the pen. Her father touched her elbow, a warning. Smile. The touch said, "Do not embarrass me, do not ruin this." Alina smiled. She took the pen. Her hand was steady. Her heart was steady. Everything inside her was perfectly, almost dangerously still, because Alina Voss had not spent the last 3 weeks weeping into her pillow. She had spent them reading, planning, and the night before she had done something her father did not know about, something the Duke could not yet suspect, something that changed every single thing about the document now sitting in front of her. She signed her name in clean, unhurried letters. The Duke glanced up just briefly, just for a fraction of a second, as if her composure had caught him off guard. Then he looked away. He should have looked longer. It had begun, as most disasters in Alina's life had, with her father's pride. Lord Voss was not a cruel man. He was something almost worse, a proud man with poor judgment and an extraordinary talent for convincing himself that things were not as bad as they appeared. For years, Alina had watched him wave away accountants, dismiss warnings, and pour money he did not have into ventures that returned nothing. She had watched the paintings disappear from the walls one by one. She had watched the good silver get quietly replaced with plate. She had said nothing, because saying something to her father was like reasoning with weather. Then the letters had started arriving. Thick envelopes, stamped with the seals of banks and solicitors, piling up on his desk with increasing urgency. Alina had not been meant to see them. She saw them anyway. She had always had a talent for seeing things she was not meant to see. The debts were catastrophic, the kind that did not get repaid, the kind that swallowed estates whole. And then, like an answer to a prayer her father had apparently sent without telling her, the Duke of Ashford had appeared. James Calloway, the 6th Duke of Ashford, did not need money. What he needed, or rather, what his solicitors had informed him he needed with considerable bureaucratic firmness, was a wife. His grandmother's estate, a separate property worth more than Ashford Manor itself, was held in a trust with a single condition attached. The Duke must be married before his 32nd birthday, or the estate would pass to a distant cousin in Edinburgh. The Duke's 32nd birthday was 4 months away. Alina had learned all of this, naturally, by reading letters she was not supposed to read. She had also learned something else, something her father did not know, something the Duke's own solicitors had apparently overlooked in their haste to arrange a suitable match. A clause, small, tucked inside the marriage contract beneath 3 paragraphs of dense legal language that most people would never bother to read carefully. Alina had read it carefully, and then she had gone to see a solicitor of her own. His name was Mr. Hale, and he operated out of a narrow office on a street her father would never have occasion to visit. She had gone on a Tuesday morning, while her father was at his club, wearing her plainest dress and her most unremarkable bonnet. She had sat across from Mr. Hale, placed the copied contract on his desk, and explained precisely what she needed. He had looked at her for a long moment over the top of his spectacles. "This," he had said carefully, "is either very clever or very reckless, Miss Voss." "Can it be done?" she had asked. Another long pause, then he had reached for his pen. "It can be done." So on the morning her father stood beside her with his shallow, sleepless breathing and his elbow touching hers in silent warning, Alina was not afraid. She was not defeated. She was not the obedient daughter being handed to a stranger like a piece of furniture included in the sale of a house. She was a woman who had already changed the terms. The Duke gathered the signed contract without ceremony and passed it to his own solicitor. He did not look at Alina again. He did not offer a word of greeting or acknowledgement, not a nod, not her name, nothing. To him, she was already an afterthought, a box checked, a problem solved. Eleanor watched him stand, button his coat, and move toward the door as if she were part of the wallpaper. That's all right, she thought, folding her hands in her lap. Underestimate me, please. Her father exhaled beside her, long and shaking with relief. Well done, he murmured, too quietly for anyone else to hear. He meant it as a compliment. Eleanor said nothing. Outside the window, a carriage was waiting to take the Duke back to Ashford Manor. In 4 weeks, it would come back for her. She had 4 weeks. It was more than enough. Ashford Manor was everything Eleanor had expected, and nothing she had prepared for. She had expected the size, the long gravel drive, the pale stone facade, the rows of windows that caught the afternoon light like cold, unblinking eyes. She had expected the staff lined up at the entrance, expressions carefully neutral, trained to reveal nothing about what they thought of the woman their master had imported like a piece of furniture. She had expected the silence that fell when the carriage door opened, and she stepped down, alone, without her father, without a friendly face in sight. What she had not expected was the feeling. It moved through her the moment her foot touched the first stone step, not fear exactly, not grief exactly, but something that lived between them. A quiet recognition that whatever came next, there was no going back to the life she had known before. The house seemed to know it too. It looked down at her with its rows of cold windows, and it waited. Eleanor lifted her chin and walked through the front door. James was not there to greet her. The housekeeper, a composed woman named Mrs. Harding, informed Eleanor that His Grace sent his apologies. He had been detained by a state business and would join her for dinner. She said this with the practiced smoothness of someone who had delivered versions of this message before, and Eleanor understood immediately that detained by a state business was the kind of phrase that would be used often in this house, and that it meant precisely nothing. Of course, Eleanor said pleasantly, would you show me to my rooms? Her rooms were fine, more than fine, beautiful, in the way that expensive, impersonal things are beautiful. Someone had arranged fresh flowers on the writing desk. Eleanor did not know if it had been James's instruction or Mrs. Harding's initiative, and she decided it did not matter. She sat at the desk, looked at the flowers for a moment, and then opened her traveling case and took out her correspondence. She had letters to write. Dinner was the first performance. James was already seated when she entered the dining room, at the head of a table long enough to seat 20, with Eleanor's place set at the opposite end, a distance that struck her as both architecturally impressive and faintly ridiculous. He stood when she entered, because manners were apparently non-negotiable even in a marriage that was not a marriage, and waited until she was seated before sitting again. A footman poured wine, another brought soup. The silence between them settled like a third guest at the table. James spoke first. I trust the journey was acceptable. Perfectly comfortable, thank you, Eleanor said. Another silence. I want to be straightforward with you, James said, setting down his spoon with the air of a man who had rehearsed this. This arrangement suits us both practically. I have no intention of making demands on your time or a slight pause, a slight tightening around the eyes, your person. You will have full use of the house, the grounds, and a quarterly allowance. In return, I ask only that you appear at necessary social engagements and conduct yourself appropriately in public. He said all of this looking at her directly, evenly, as if reading from a document. Eleanor looked back at him with equal evenness. He was, she noticed for the first time with something approaching objectivity, rather strikingly handsome, dark eyes, sharp jaw, the kind of face that would have been warm if it were not so determinedly closed. It wasn't. It was a face that had decided, some years ago, to let nothing in and give nothing away. That sounds very reasonable, Eleanor said. Something flickered across his expression. She thought it might have been surprise. Good, he said. He picked up his spoon again. Conversation, apparently, was over. Eleanor ate her soup and said nothing further. She was, in fact, perfectly content with silence. Silence suited her plans very well. The Dowager Duchess arrived on a Thursday. Alina had been at Ashford Manor for exactly 11 days, and she had spent those 11 days learning everything she could about the house, its rhythms, its staff, its routines, its secrets. She had walked every corridor. She had spoken to every servant who would speak to her, and she had done it in the unhurried, genuine way that made people forget they were being observed. She had learned which floorboards creaked, which doors locked from the inside, which windows overlooked the lane where the post was delivered each morning. She had also learned, from a brief and carefully casual exchange with Mrs. Harding, that James's mother visited without warning and stayed without invitation for as long as she pleased. Margaret Calloway, the Dowager Duchess of Ashford, swept into the manor like weather. She was tall, white-haired, and possessed of the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent 60 years being obeyed. She looked Alina up and down in the entrance hall with the slow, assessing thoroughness of someone examining a purchase they suspected had been misrepresented. So the Dowager said, "You are the Voss girl." "I am Alina," Alina said, pleasantly, steadily. "It is a pleasure to meet you." "Is it?" The Dowager's gaze moved over Alina's dress, her posture, her face, and returned to her eyes with an expression that communicated a complete and unfavorable verdict. "My son tells me you were agreeable about the arrangement." "I was." A pause that managed to contain volumes. The last woman James was attached to was not agreeable about anything. It was one of her better qualities. Alina understood then the Dowager was going to make a point of mentioning Vivienne, regularly, strategically, in rooms full of people. "She sounds formidable," Alina said, with every appearance of genuine admiration. The Dowager blinked. Whatever response she had been braced for, it was not that. Alina smiled and excused herself to dress for dinner. Vivienne Ashworth appeared 10 days later. She arrived at a small supper James hosted for neighboring families, a social obligation. He had told Alina the night before, brief and unavoidable. He had not mentioned that Vivienne would be among the guests. Alina did not know whether this was deliberate or careless. She was beginning to suspect that with James Calloway, there was very little difference between the two. Vivienne was everything the Dowager's pointed silences had promised, beautiful in the polished, self-aware way of a woman who had never once doubted her own significance, dressed in deep green that made every other woman in the room look slightly underdressed, moving through the gathering with the ease of someone who considered herself the rightful center of it. She came to Alina first, which told Alina everything. "You must be the new Duchess," Vivienne said, with a smile that was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to be unremarkable, cool enough to land like a warning. "James has spoken of you." "Has he?" Alina said. "Only briefly, I'm afraid." The smile didn't waver. "He is not a man who speaks at length about things that have already been decided." Across the room, James was speaking to another guest, his back partially turned. He was not watching, or if he was very good at appearing not to. "No," Alina agreed, in a tone of such cheerful concurrence that Vivienne had no clean place to go with it. "He isn't." A brief silence. Vivienne's smile sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Well," she said, "I hope you find Ashford suits you." "I'm finding it suits me very well," Alina said. "Better every day." She held Vivienne's gaze for one beat longer than was strictly necessary, then turned to greet the guest arriving on her left. Behind her, she heard nothing. No retreat of footsteps, no sharp exhale, but she felt it. That night, after the guests had gone and the house had gone quiet, Alina sat at her writing desk and took out the letter she had received that morning from Mr. Hale. Everything was in order, he wrote. The amendment held. The timeline was confirmed, 6 months. She had 6 months to either build something real in this house, or walk away from it clean, with her father's debts settled and her future her own. She folded the letter, held it for a moment, and then looked out the window at the dark grounds of Ashford Manor stretching away into the night. 6 months, she thought, and he has not yet looked at me long enough to see me. She was not sure, sitting there in the quiet, whether that was an advantage or whether it was beginning just slightly, just at the edges, to bother her. She decided it was an advantage. She put out the lamp and went to bed. James Calloway was not, by nature, a curious man. He had learned earlier than most, and harder than most, that curiosity was a luxury that cost more than it returned. Curiosity led you to ask questions. Questions led you to answers, and answers, in his experience, had a way of rearranging things you had been perfectly comfortable leaving in place. He had built his life on the foundation of not needing to know more than was necessary, and it had served him well. He told himself this on a Tuesday night in October, standing in the darkened corridor outside the East Wing Library, watching a thin line of lamplight under the closed door. It was past midnight. The house was silent. Every member of the staff had long retired, and Alina was awake. This was not the first time. He had noticed it a week ago purely by accident, purely because his own study was on the same corridor and he kept irregular hours himself. The light under her door, burning long after the house had gone dark. He had thought nothing of it the first night, nor the second. But this was the 4th time in 7 days, and James Calloway, who was not by nature a curious man, found himself standing in a dark corridor at midnight wondering what his wife was doing. He went back to his study. He did not sleep particularly well. He began, without fully admitting to himself that he was doing it, to pay attention. Not obviously. He was too disciplined for that, too practiced at the art of appearing uninterested. But he started to notice things he had previously looked past. The way Alina moved through the house with a quiet purposefulness that was different from the uncertain hovering he had half expected from a woman dropped into unfamiliar surroundings. She did not hover. She did not seek approval or reassurance from the staff. She learned things, he could see it happening. The slow, methodical accumulation of knowledge about Ashford Manor, its people, its routines. And she did it so naturally that it took him 2 weeks to realize it was deliberate. She spoke to Mrs. Harding every morning, not with the brittle authority of a woman asserting herself, but with genuine interest, asking questions, remembering answers, following up the next day on things the housekeeper had mentioned in passing. He had overheard Mrs. Harding tell the under-butler, in a tone of mild bewilderment, that the new Duchess was remarkably easy to talk to. Mrs. Harding did not find many people easy to talk to. He noticed the way Alina handled his mother, which was to say, the way she refused to be handled by her. The dowager had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the pointed remark, the weighted silence, the comparison deployed like a small blade. Alina absorbed every one of them with a pleasantness so genuine and so unassailable that his mother had actually complained to him about it. "She agrees with everything I say," the dowager had said, in the tone of a woman deeply aggrieved. "It is extremely irritating." James had found, to his own surprise, that he had to look away to conceal his expression. And then there were the letters. Alina wrote them late at night, which he already knew. But she also received them, not through the main post, which came to the house each morning and passed through Mrs. Harding's hands in the ordinary way, but through a separate arrangement he had not noticed until he happened to be at the east window on a Wednesday morning and saw a young boy deliver a small envelope directly to Alina on the garden path. Alina took it, slipped it into her pocket, and continued her walk without breaking stride. As if she had been expecting it, as if this had happened before, he told himself it was none of his concern. He had been very clear with her at the beginning. Her time was her own, her business was her own. He wanted only public compliance and nothing further. He had meant it. He still meant it. Whatever Alina was corresponding about, whoever she was corresponding with, was entirely outside the boundaries of what he had any right to question. He lasted 4 more days. It was a Thursday when he finally saw her leave. He had not been watching for it, or so he told himself, ignoring the fact that he had positioned himself in the upstairs study at precisely the hour she usually took her morning walk, with a clear line of sight to the front drive. He saw the carriage. Small, unmarked, the kind hired by the hour rather than kept by families of any standing. Alina came down the front steps dressed plainly, no maid accompanying her, and stepped inside with the brisk efficiency of someone who knew exactly where they were going. James stood at the window for a moment after the carriage had gone. Then he called for his horse. He did not follow her. He was not going to follow her. That was beyond any boundary he was willing to cross, and he knew it. But he rode into the village, and he asked, in the offhand way of a man with no particular interest in the answer, whether anyone had seen the Duchess in town recently. The innkeeper's wife had. 2 weeks prior, she said. The Duchess had stopped to ask directions to Hale Street. Hale Street. James knew Hale Street. It was not a street that had occasion to appear in his daily life, but he knew it the way any man of property knew the city's legal geography, because Hale Street was where the independent solicitors operated. The ones who worked outside the established firms. The ones hired by people who needed advice they did not want traced back to them. He rode home. He sat in his study for a long time looking at nothing. A solicitor. Alina had been to see a solicitor before the wedding or after it or both, and she was still corresponding with someone, and she had been smiling when she signed the marriage contract, and he had noticed the smile and dismissed it, and now he was sitting here understanding, with a cold and dawning clarity, that he had made an error. He did not know what kind of error. He did not know its shape or its size or what it would cost him. But something was moving beneath the surface of his orderly, carefully managed arrangement, and he had been too certain of his own control to see it until now. He thought about going to her directly. He was not a man who avoided confrontation. He had always preferred to meet problems head-on rather than wait for them to arrive at his door. But something stopped him. Not uncertainty, exactly. Something more precise than that. He did not know enough yet. And walking into a conversation with Alina without knowing enough felt, instinctively, like a mistake he could not afford. So he waited. He was still waiting 3 days later, when Alina knocked on the door of his study. She did not wait for him to invite her in. She opened the door and stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression composed and pleasant in the way it always was. That expression he was beginning to find profoundly unreadable. "You followed me to the village," she said. It was not a question. James set down his pen. He did not insult her by denying it. "I asked after you in the village," he said. "There is a distinction. A narrow one. Perhaps," he looked at her steadily, "you have been meeting with a solicitor." A pause, very brief, barely perceptible, but he caught it. "I have business of my own," Alina said. "You told me my time was my own. You told me my affairs were my own." "I did." "Then I don't believe I owe you an explanation." She was right. Technically, precisely, legally right, and she knew it, and he knew it, and the knowledge sat between them like something solid. "Who is he?" James said. "A solicitor," Alina said, "as you already know." "What business do you have that requires an independent solicitor?" "My own." She held his gaze without flinching, without defiance, without anxiety, just that steady, unreachable calm that he was beginning to find more unsettling than any amount of visible emotion would have been. "Is there anything else?" There were approximately 12 things he wanted to say. He said none of them. "No," he said. Alina nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already known. She stepped back from the doorway. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. She pulled the door closed behind her, quietly, without any particular emphasis. James sat in his study for a long time after she had gone, looking at the closed door. He was not accustomed to feeling outmaneuvered. He was not accustomed to sitting across from someone and being unable to locate the edges of what they knew, what they wanted, what they were prepared to do. He was not accustomed to Alina Voss. He picked up his pen, put it down again. What he thought have I missed? The letter arrived on a Friday morning. James was in the breakfast room when Mrs. Harding brought it in, not through the ordinary post, not through any channel he recognized, but hand-delivered by a man who had apparently presented himself at the servants' entrance at 7 in the morning, and refused to leave until the envelope was accepted. Mrs. Harding relayed this information with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood that the atmosphere in Ashford Manor had shifted in recent weeks in ways she could not entirely account for. James looked at the envelope. His name was on it in a hand he did not recognize. No seal, no return address, just his name written with the clean, unhurried precision of someone who had taken their time. He opened it. It was from Mr. Hale. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the breakfast table, very carefully, the way you set down something fragile that you are no longer certain you are equipped to handle. Then he read it a third time. Mr. Hale wrote with the measured, precise language of a man who had spent decades choosing words for their legal weight rather than their emotional effect. He wrote without apology and without embellishment. He wrote as a solicitor informing a relevant party of facts he had a professional obligation to disclose, now that, he noted, certain conditions made disclosure both appropriate and, in his judgment, overdue. The facts were these. The marriage contract signed by Alina Voss and James Calloway, 6th Duke of Ashford, contained an amendment. The amendment had been incorporated into the document in the 72 hours between the contract's initial drafting and its signing, inserted, with considerable legal precision, into a subsection of the third clause that addressed the terms and conditions of the union's continuance. The language was dense. It was meant to be dense. It had been written by someone who understood that the people most likely to read it would be looking for other things and would not linger. The amendment stated the following. If, at the conclusion of 6 calendar months from the date of signing, the marriage could not be demonstrated to constitute a genuine union, evidenced by shared residence in good faith, public acknowledgement, and mutual conduct consistent with matrimonial intent, then the contract's financial provisions would be triggered in full. Lord Voss's debts, absorbed by the Duke as part of the arrangement, would be considered settled and irrevocable. Alina Voss would be entitled to a separate legal settlement, and either party would have the right to petition for dissolution on grounds of contractual non-fulfillment. In plain language, Alina had built herself a door. If James kept his distance, if he treated her as he had promised to treat her, as a convenient arrangement, as a name on paper, as a woman he had no intention of truly knowing, then at the end of 6 months she could walk away. Her father would be saved. She would be free. And James would have no legal recourse because he would have fulfilled to the letter every condition that triggered her exit. She had not trapped him. She had trapped his indifference. Mr. Hale concluded by noting that he had advised his client to inform the Duke directly, and that his client had declined, citing. And here the solicitor's language grew, for just a moment, almost dry enough to be called wry, a preference for allowing the Duke to draw his own conclusions in his own time. James put the letter down. He sat for a long moment in the silent breakfast room, the untouched food in front of him going cold, the morning light moving slowly across the tablecloth. Then, with great deliberateness, he stood up. He found her in the garden. She was walking the path along the south wall, her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her face turned slightly toward the pale autumn sun with an expression of such genuine tranquility that for a moment he simply stopped and looked at her. She looked like a woman with nothing on her mind. He had never been so thoroughly deceived by an expression in his life. "Mrs. Hale," he said. Alina turned. She looked at his face, then at the letter in his hand, and something moved through her expression, not guilt, not fear, not the flinching retreat of someone caught. Something quieter, something that might, in another context, have been relief. "Mr. Hale," she said, "he wrote to you." He did. James stopped a few feet from her. He had rehearsed, in the 10 minutes between reading the letter and finding her, approximately 4 versions of this conversation. Every version had begun with controlled anger. None of them had accounted for the fact that she would look at him like that, steady and open and almost tired, like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. "You amended the contract." "I did." "Before the signing." "Yes." "Without telling me." Elinor looked at him for a moment. "Would you have signed it if I had told you?" The answer was so obvious that it required no voice. They both knew it. He would not have signed it. He would have had his own solicitors tear it apart and start again, and Elinor would have had no leverage and no door and no plan, and she would have walked into this house with nothing but her father's debts and a husband who had made clear from the first moment that she was an afterthought. "No," he said, "I would not." "Then you understand why I didn't." He looked at her. The letter felt very light in his hand suddenly for something that had landed so heavily. "You have been here 2 months," he said. 2 months, and every conversation, every dinner, he stopped, reorganized. "You have been counting days." "I have been living in your house," Elinor said. Her voice was even, but something in it had shifted, a careful quality, a measured quality, as if she was choosing words the way you choose footholds on uncertain ground. "I have tried to conduct myself properly. I have not made demands. I have not caused difficulties. I have done precisely what you asked." "You have been planning to leave." "I have been ensuring I had the choice." She held his gaze. "There is a difference." James said nothing. The garden was very quiet around them, the soft movement of dry leaves, the distant sound of a horse in the stable yard, nothing else. "6 months," he said. "6 months," she confirmed, "4 remaining." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back, not defiantly, not apologetically, just with that clear, unshielded steadiness that he was beginning to understand was not a performance. It was simply who she was. A woman who looked at things directly because looking away had never served her. "And if I had been different," he said slowly, working it out as he spoke. If I had not told you to keep your distance, if I had made some effort to," he stopped. "Then the clause would never need to be used," Elinor said quietly. "It was never meant to punish you. It was meant to protect me." The distinction landed differently than he expected. He had come into the garden prepared to be angry, and he was angry, underneath everything. Some cold and wounded part of him that did not enjoy being outmaneuvered was very angry indeed. But anger required a villain, and he was standing in front of a woman who had been handed to a stranger by a desperate father, and had responded by sitting down and reading the contract so carefully that she found a way to protect herself, and he could not locate the villainy in that. He had looked for it, on the walk from the house to the garden, and he had not found it. What he found instead was something that made him considerably more uncomfortable. He had done exactly what she had predicted he would do. He had been precisely as indifferent, precisely as distant, precisely as dismissive as she had apparently calculated he would be. She had not misjudged him. She had read him before the signing, before she had spent a single day in his house, and she had been correct. That was what sat in his chest now, heavier than the anger. Not that she had outmaneuvered him, that she had known him well enough to do it. 4 months, he said again. Yes. He looked at the letter in his hand. Then he folded it once and put it in his coat pocket. I see, he said. Elinor watched him. She was very still. Whatever she had expected from this conversation, whatever she had steeled herself for, he could see her recalibrating in real time, trying to read him the way he was trying to read her, and finding it, for once, not entirely simple. Good, he was tired of being the only one who found the other person unreadable. Will you be at dinner? He said, a pause. Yes, she said carefully. Then I will see you at dinner, James said. He turned and walked back toward the house. He did not hurry. He did not look back. Behind him, the garden was quiet. That evening, for the first time since Elinor had arrived at Ashford Manor, James was seated before she entered the dining room. He stood when she came in. He always stood. It was non-negotiable, but this time when she was seated, he did not look back at his plate. He looked at her. "Tell me something," he said. Eleanor's hand paused, very briefly, over her wine glass. "What would you like to know?" "Anything," James said. "Something true." A silence. Not the cold, empty silence of their previous dinners, something different, something with more texture, more weight. Then Eleanor looked up. "I read your estate ledgers," she said. "The ones in the library 3 weeks ago." A pause. "Your Eastern tenant properties are being mismanaged. The numbers have been falsified, not dramatically, but consistently over at least 2 years. Whoever is doing it is careful, but not careful enough." James stared at her. "I did not know how to tell you," she said, with the air of someone who had been waiting, with some impatience, for an appropriate moment. "You were not speaking to me about anything of substance." The silence that followed was very different from any silence that had come before it. "Show me," James said. Eleanor set down her wine glass, pushed back her chair, and stood. For the first time since she had arrived at Ashford Manor, James Calloway followed his wife. Things did not become simple after that. James had not expected them to. He was not a man who confused a single honest conversation for a resolution. He had lived long enough to know that one cracked door did not mean the walls had come down. But something had shifted in the house, something subtle and structural. The way a room feels different after furniture has been rearranged even before you can identify what has moved. They worked on the ledgers together for 3 evenings. It was Eleanor who had found the pattern, a small, recurring discrepancy in the Eastern tenant accounts, the kind that would be invisible to anyone who looked at each quarter in isolation, but became unmistakable when you laid 5 years side by side. She had laid them side by side. She had made notes in the margins in her small, precise handwriting, cross-referencing dates and figures with a methodical patience that James recognized, with some discomfort, as matching his own. The culprit, they established by the 3rd evening, was almost certainly his Eastern land agent, a man named Prewitt who had held the position for 6 years, and who James had trusted with considerable autonomy, because the man had always seemed. James could see it now with grim clarity, reliably uninteresting. "He relied on you not looking closely," Eleanor said, on the 3rd evening, turning a page. "He relied on no one looking closely," James said. "Yes," a pause, "but particularly you." James looked at her. She was not being unkind. There was no edge in it, no satisfaction. She was simply being accurate in the way she was always accurate, the way that had stopped feeling like an affront and started feeling like something he had not known he needed. "You're right," he said. Eleanor glanced up. Something flickered in her expression, brief and unguarded, gone almost before it arrived. As if being agreed with, directly and without qualification, was not something she had extensive experience of. She looked back at the ledger. "Prewitt will need to be confronted," she said. "Next week," James said. "I'll go to the Eastern properties myself." "I'd like to come." He looked at her again. She met his eyes steadily, waiting, not pressing. "All right," he said. They went on a Tuesday. It was the first time they had traveled together, and James had half expected it to be awkward. The long carriage ride, the enforced proximity, the absence of the house's routines to organize their interactions around. It was not awkward. Eleanor looked out the window at the passing countryside and asked him questions about the Eastern properties, their history, their tenants, their particular difficulties, and James answered. And she listened in the way she always listened, with her full attention, following up on things he said with questions that indicated she had actually heard him, and not simply waited for him to stop speaking. He could not remember the last time he had had a conversation like that. He did not examine this thought. He set it aside and looked out his own window and answered her next question. Prewitt had not expected them. His face, When he opened his office door and found the Duke and Duchess on his threshold without advance notice, told James everything he needed to know about the man's guilt before a single word was exchanged. The confrontation was brief and unpleasant and conclusive. Prewitt was dismissed before they left. James wrote 3 letters on the return journey, his portfolio balanced on his knee, Elinor sitting across from him, reading a book she had brought, the carriage moving steadily through the gray afternoon. It was, he thought, looking up from the 3rd letter, a remarkably companionable silence. He looked at Elinor. She did not look up from her book. The afternoon light caught the side of her face, and James Calloway, who had spent 10 weeks telling himself that Elinor was a practical arrangement and nothing further, felt something move through him that he had absolutely no framework for handling. He looked back at his letter. He finished it very carefully. The trouble started the following week. It started, as trouble in that world usually did, at a dinner party, Lady Forsyth's autumn gathering, 20 guests, the kind of event that operated simultaneously as social occasion and information exchange, where everything said and unsaid was noted and catalogued by people who made it their business to notice. Elinor had been, by any measure, faultless. She had dressed well and spoken well and navigated the room with the ease of a woman who had been doing this all her life, which she had not. Her family's reduced circumstances had kept her largely outside the season's most significant events for the past several years. You would not have known it. She spoke to everyone with genuine interest, remembered names, asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, and managed to make Lady Forsyth, a notoriously difficult woman to please, visibly warm to her by the end of the fish course. James had watched this from across the room with something that took him an embarrassingly long time to identify as pride. And then Vivienne had arrived. She was late, deliberately, James suspected, knowing as she certainly did that a late entrance at Lady Forsyth's dinner was a calculated act. She came in on the arm of Lord Ashworth, her brother, and she moved through the assembled guests with the confidence of a woman who considered herself the fixed point around which rooms arranged themselves. She found Elinor within 10 minutes. James saw it happen from across the room and moved, not quickly enough. "My dear Duchess," Vivienne said with her perfect, calibrated warmth, "you look remarkably settled. One would almost think you had been at Ashford for years." "One grows comfortable quickly when one is made welcome," Elinor said pleasantly. "Of course." A pause, weighted and deliberate. "Though I understand the arrangement has its particular qualities, not every marriage is conventional, is it?" The room did not go quiet. It was too skilled a room for that. But several conversations in the immediate vicinity took on a slightly different quality, a slight increase in attentiveness, the way a room of practiced listeners adjusts when something worth hearing begins. Elinor looked at Vivienne with an expression of mild, polite inquiry. "I'm not sure I know what you mean." "Only that James has always valued practicality." Vivienne's smile did not waver. "It is one of his most consistent qualities. He approaches most things as transactions, even relationships." It was skillfully done. It could be dismissed as a general observation. It could equally be understood as a public assertion that Elinor's marriage was a business arrangement and nothing more. And if that idea took root in this room, in this company, it would move through London society with the speed and thoroughness of fire through dry grass. "How interesting," Elinor said. "I find him remarkably impractical about some things." Vivienne blinked. "Oh." "He spent an hour last week arguing with me about the correct interpretation of a passage in Gibbon," Elinor said, with the fond, slightly exasperated air of a woman sharing a minor domestic truth. "An hour, over a footnote." She shook her head. "Practical men do not lose arguments about footnotes. They simply don't have them." A ripple of genuine amusement moved through the nearby cluster of guests. Vivienne's smile stayed in place, but its foundations had shifted, something beneath it had gone uncertain. James arrived at Alina's elbow. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. "Not at all," Alina said. She looked up at him with an expression that was warm and easy and completely natural and absolutely devastating in its effect, because it looked entirely real. Miss Ashworth was just saying how much she admires practicality. "Was she?" James said. He looked at Vivienne. Vivienne looked back at him with an expression he recognized, the expression of a woman recalculating. "We were reminiscing," she said lightly. "How pleasant," James said, in a tone that indicated he found it neither pleasant nor particularly interesting. "Alina, Lady Forsyth was asking for you." He placed his hand at the small of Alina's back lightly, briefly, a gesture so natural that he did it before he had decided to do it, and felt the slight catch in her breath that she concealed almost immediately and guided her away. Behind them, Vivienne said nothing. In the carriage home, Alina sat across from him in the dark and looked out the window. "Thank you," she said after a while, "for coming over." "You were handling it," James said. "I was," a pause, "but it was better with you there." He looked at her. The carriage lamps made the shadows move across her face, and she was still looking out the window, and he could not see her expression clearly, and he found that he very much wanted to. "She will not stop," he said. "No," Alina's voice was even. "She won't." "She knows something," James said, "or she suspects something about the contract." A silence. "Yes," Alina said quietly, "I think she does." James said nothing. The carriage moved through the dark streets and he thought about Vivienne's expression, not the cultivated surface of it but the thing underneath, the calculation, the intent. Vivienne was not a woman who made social maneuvers without purpose. She had come to that dinner to do something specific. She had not tonight done it, which meant she was waiting. For what exactly was the question that kept him awake long after the carriage had returned to Ashford Manor, long after the house had gone quiet, long after the thin line of lamplight he had grown accustomed to watching for under Alina's door had finally gone dark? He found out 3 days later. Not from Vivienne directly. Vivienne was too careful for that. It came through the Dowager, which was, James reflected, a more elegant delivery mechanism than anything he could have anticipated. His mother arrived on a Thursday morning unannounced, as always, and requested to speak with him privately, and presented him, over tea, with the following information. Vivienne had obtained a copy of the marriage contract. Not the amended version. The original, the version drafted before Alina had gone to Mr. Hale, the version that contained none of Alina's additions, the version that made the transaction's nature entirely plain. And she intended, his mother informed him with the air of a woman delivering news she considered both important and overdue, to show it to Lord Hartley, who wrote for the Gazette, who would find the discrepancy between the original and final versions extremely interesting, as would his readership. The girl amended the contract, his mother said, watching him, before signing. "I know," James said. His mother paused. "You know." "Yes." A silence. The Dowager looked at her son with an expression that cycled in the space of a few seconds, through surprise, reassessment, and something that might, in a different woman, have been called respect. "And," she said. "And it is not Vivienne's business," James said, "nor the Gazette's." "James," his mother set down her teacup, "if this becomes public, the amendment, the clause, the exit provision, it will not become public. You cannot know that. Vivienne has the original document. She has a contact at the Gazette, if she chooses to." "She will not choose to," James said. His mother looked at him steadily. "What makes you certain?" James said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the carriage ride home from Lady Forsyth's dinner, and Alina's voice saying it was better with you there, and the way she had looked out the window after, and the lamplight under her door that burned long after midnight while she wrote letters to a solicitor who had become, without James fully accounting for when it happened, less of a threat and more of a measure of exactly how badly he had misjudged the woman he had married. "Because I am going to speak to her first," he said. His mother studied him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, slow and reluctant, the way a fixed opinion moves when it is finally presented with sufficient reason to move. "The Voss girl," she said, not a question exactly, something more like a verdict being revised. "Alina," James said, quietly but clearly. "Her name is Alina." The dowager picked up her teacup. She said nothing further, but she did not argue. He went to Alina that evening. He found her in the library, not unusual. She spent most of her evenings in the library now, and he had developed the habit of knowing where she was in the house without examining why he knew. She looked up when he entered, and something in his expression must have communicated the weight of what he was carrying, because she closed her book without being asked and waited. He told her about Vivienne, about the original contract, about the Gazette. He watched her face as he spoke. She did not go pale. She did not flinch. She absorbed the information with that particular stillness of hers, the stillness he had once mistaken for coldness and now understood was simply the way she processed things that mattered. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How did she get it?" Alina asked. "My solicitors," James said. "Someone in the office. I will deal with that separately." Alina nodded. She looked at the fire for a moment. "If it becomes public," she said slowly, "it won't only reflect badly on me. It will reflect badly on you. People will say you didn't read your own marriage contract carefully enough to notice an amendment. I know. They will say you were fooled by a woman with no money and no connections and no particular social standing. I know that too." She looked at him and James met her eyes. "And I am less concerned with what people say than with what Vivienne is intending to do and how to prevent it." Alina studied him for a moment. Then she nodded once with the decisive quality of someone moving from assessment to action. "All right," she said. "Then here is what I think we should do." She leaned forward. James leaned forward too, instinctively, drawn in by that voice, that mind, that particular quality of attention she brought to problems that made everything feel solvable. Outside the library windows, the autumn night pressed cold and dark against the glass. Inside, the fire burned steadily. And somewhere across the city, Vivienne Ashworth made her plans. The invitation came from Lord and Lady Pemberton. A winter gathering, not a ball exactly, something more intimate and therefore more dangerous. 30 guests rather than 300, the kind of evening where there was nowhere to hide and nothing to dilute the attention of 30 pairs of practiced, observant eyes. Lady Pemberton was one of London's most significant social arbiters, a woman whose approval could open doors and whose disapproval could close them permanently. An invitation to her winter gathering was not declined. Alina and James accepted. They had discussed, in the library over the following 3 evenings, what Vivienne was likely to do and when. Alina's view was that Vivienne would not go directly to the Gazette, not yet. The document was leverage, and leverage lost its power the moment it was used. Vivienne would prefer to use it as a threat first, to see what it produced. She would find an occasion, Alina said, somewhere public enough to matter, somewhere the audience would carry the story forward on her behalf, and she would introduce the information in a way that looked like careless disclosure rather than calculated attack. "The Pemberton gathering," James said on the 3rd evening. Alina looked at him. "She will have received an invitation," he said. "She always does, and it is exactly the kind of room she would choose." Alina was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said, "I think so too." They looked at each other across the firelight. "Then we know where," James said, "and approximately when." "Knowing doesn't stop it," Alina said. Her voice was even, but something underneath it was not a quality he had not heard before, something stripped of its usual careful management. If she shows them the original contract and then the amendment, if she frames it correctly, as a deception. It was not a deception, James said. Alina looked at him. James. It was not, he said firmly, meeting her eyes. It was a woman protecting herself from a situation she had no power to refuse. Anyone with any sense will understand that. Society does not always reward sense, Alina said quietly. No, he agreed, but it rewards performance, and we are going to perform. The night of the Pemberton gathering arrived cold and clear. Alina dressed carefully, not elaborately, not in the way that announced effort, but with the kind of considered simplicity that was its own statement. Deep blue, her mother's pearls, her hair arranged without fuss. She looked, James thought when he met her at the top of the stairs, like a woman who had nothing to prove and knew it. He offered his arm. She took it, and they went down together. The evening proceeded with the surface smoothness of any well-managed social occasion. Lord Pemberton was genial and loud and interested in his horses. Lady Pemberton was sharp and warm in equal measure, the combination that made her so effective. You felt genuinely liked by her, and also, somewhere underneath the warmth, faintly assessed. She received Alina with visible curiosity and visible approval, which James noted with quiet satisfaction. Alina moved through the room beside him and also independently of him. They were not the kind of couple who needed to be joined at the elbow to communicate unity, and Alina seemed to understand this instinctively. She spoke to the women with the same genuine attention she brought to everything, and she listened to the men with a quality of interest that was neither performative nor deferential, and James watched the room's attitude toward her shift over the course of an hour, from polite curiosity to something warmer. Vivienne arrived at 8:30. She came in alone. Lord Ashworth was not with her tonight, which told James something about the nature of what she was planning. A brother provided witnesses. Arriving alone provided deniability. She greeted Lady Pemberton. She greeted several other guests. She made her way around the room with the patient, purposeful movement of a woman who had a destination in mind, and was simply taking the scenic route to it. She arrived at Alina's side during a pause between conversations, when Alina was momentarily alone. James had stepped aside to speak with Pemberton about an estate matter, near enough to see but far enough. Vivienne had calculated to not overhear. She had not calculated that James Calloway, for the first time in recent memory, was not fully attending to the conversation in front of him. He was watching his wife. He could not hear what Vivienne said. He saw Alina's face, the slight change in it, the way the warmth of the evening dimmed by a fraction, replaced by that careful stillness. He saw Vivienne open her evening bag and remove something, folded paper, small, handled with the deliberateness of a woman who knew its value. He moved. He was not fast enough. By the time he had covered the distance, Vivienne had already turned to include the nearest cluster of guests in what she was saying: Lord and Lady Cavendish, Sir Philip Moore, Mrs. Hartley, whose husband was, of course, the man who wrote for the Gazette. All of them were looking at the paper Vivienne held, and at Alina, and their expressions held the particular quality of people who have just been given information they are still processing. Simply think it is the kind of thing one ought to know, Vivienne was saying, in the carrying, regretful tone of a woman reluctantly performing a public service. When a contract contains provisions that were not disclosed to all parties. It was disclosed, Alina said. Her voice was perfectly level, every head turned. My dear, Vivienne said, with a compassion so precisely manufactured it was almost admirable, the original document. The original document was superseded, Alina said, by the signed document which both parties signed. She paused, which is how contracts work. A silence, not the polished, managed silence of a room pretending not to listen, a real silence, sudden and total. You amended it, Vivienne said, without the Duke's knowledge. I amended it, Alina said, and the Duke signed it. If he did not read it carefully enough to notice, that is a matter between him and his solicitors, not a matter for, she glanced at Mrs. Hartley, briefly and deliberately, general discussion. Mrs. Hartley had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. The clause, Vivienne pressed, her voice still carrying that terrible sympathy, gives you the right to leave, does it not? It was designed so that you could walk away from this marriage at the 6-month mark with your father's debts settled without consequence. You entered this marriage already planning to leave it. The room held its breath. Eleanor opened her mouth. James spoke first. He had not planned what he said. This was unusual for him. He was a man who planned, who measured, who did not speak without knowing where the words were going. But he was standing in Lady Pemberton's drawing room looking at his wife's face, and underneath Eleanor's composure, underneath the steadiness and the levelness and the careful management, he could see something that he recognized because he had spent 10 weeks refusing to look at it directly. She was braced. She was standing there in her mother's pearls with her hands still at her sides and her chin level, and she was braced. The way someone is braced who has been knocked down before and knows it is coming again, and has decided that this time they will remain standing through it through sheer force of will. And she was not going to ask him for help, because she had never asked him for anything and did not know how. And she was going to handle this alone, because she had handled everything alone and he had let her. He had stood at a distance and called it respect, and let her carry everything herself. She didn't plan to leave, James said. Every face turned to him. He was aware of the room in the peripheral way of a man who has decided that the room is not the point. The point was Eleanor. Eleanor, who had turned to look at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, unguarded, unmanaged, a crack in the composure wide enough to see through. She planned to have a choice, he said, which she did not have before she signed that contract, which she should have had and did not, because she was given to me by a father who needed money and a solicitor who needed a fee and a duke. He heard himself, felt something tighten in his chest, who did not look up from his desk long enough to see that there was a person in the room. Silence. He looked at Vivienne. The clause exists because she was not protected, because no one protected her, because she was handed a pen and told to smile. He paused. She smiled, and then she made sure she had a door. I would have done the same. Vivienne stared at him. Whatever she had prepared for, it was not this. James, she began. She is my wife, James said, not loudly, not with any particular emphasis, just clearly in the way of a man stating a fact that is not open for reinterpretation. And she is the smartest person in this room. He looked finally at Eleanor. Her face had done something extraordinary. The composure was still there. Eleanor's composure was constitutional. It did not simply dissolve, but the bracing was gone. The thing she had been holding herself against was gone. In its place was something open and undefended and almost painfully young, as if the person Eleanor had been before she had learned to be careful was briefly, completely visible. She looked at him. He looked back. Behind them, the room began, very carefully, to breathe again. Lady Pemberton, who had not become London's preeminent social arbiter by missing her moments, chose this one with precision. Well, she said into the recovering silence, with the tone of a woman closing a subject that was now closed. I believe supper is ready. Shall we go through? The room moved. Conversations resumed, carefully redirected. The practiced social organism of 30 well-trained people absorbing an awkward moment and metabolizing it into something manageable. Vivienne stood for a moment, the folded paper still in her hand, looking at James with an expression that had lost all its architecture. The warmth, the sympathy, the calculation all gone, replaced by something that was almost underneath everything sad. Then she folded the paper, put it back in her bag, and walked toward the dining room. James and Eleanor walked to supper last. They were side by side, not touching, but close enough that he was aware of her with a totality that had nothing to do with proximity. She was very quiet. The room was moving around them, guests filing through the double doors, voices resuming their ordinary registers. "You didn't have to do that," Alina said very quietly. "I know," James said. "You could have said nothing. Let me handle it." "You were handling it." "Yes." "I know." He kept his eyes forward. "I didn't want you to have to." A silence. They reached the dining room doors. Around them, guests were finding their places, chairs scraping, candles flickering in the movement of bodies. Alina stopped. James stopped too, half a step ahead of her, and turned. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, which was unusual, because he had become, over the past weeks, considerably better at reading her. But this was something new, something that had not had occasion to appear before tonight, because tonight was the first time he had done what he had just done. "For months," she said softly. He held her gaze. "Yes. That's how long is left." "I know." She looked at him for a long moment. In the candle-lit doorway of Lady Pemberton's dining room, with 30 people arranging themselves 10 feet away, and the smell of winter cold still in the air from the entrance hall, Alina Voss looked at her husband, and he looked back at her, and neither of them said the thing that was there to be said. It was too large for a doorway. "We should go in," Alina said. "We should," James agreed. They went in. But something had come with them through the door, something that had not existed when the evening began, something that had no name yet but occupied space, real and undeniable in the narrow distance between them. Neither of them spoke of it on the carriage ride home. Neither of them needed to. That night, James stood in his study for a long time before sitting down. He thought about Alina in the garden, the morning he had confronted her about the contract. "It was never meant to punish you. It was meant to protect me." He thought about the ledgers, spread across the library table between them, her handwriting in the margins. He thought about the carriage ride back from the Eastern properties, her face turned to the window, the afternoon light on her cheek. He thought about her standing in Lady Pemberton's drawing room, braced for the blow, not asking for help. He thought about 4 months. 4 months remaining on a clock she had set herself, in the 72 hours between the contract's drafting and its signing, when she had been alone and unprotected, and had responded by sitting down and reading every word until she found a way to save herself. James Calloway sat down at his desk. He did not write anything. He simply sat in the quiet house, listening to the silence of a home that had begun without his permission to feel inhabited. After a while, he looked up at the ceiling. Then he looked at the door. Down the corridor, he knew there was lamplight under Alina's door. He stood up. He sat back down. He stood up again, and this time he stayed standing. He walked to the door of his study, opened it, and stood in the darkened corridor looking at the thin gold line of light at the far end. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back to his desk, sat down, and picked up his pen. He wrote one sentence. He folded the paper. He walked to Alina's door and slid it underneath. Then he went to bed. In the morning, Alina came down to breakfast before him, which was unusual. She was seated when he entered, her hands folded on the table, the folded note in front of her. She looked up when he came in. He sat down. The footman poured coffee. Neither of them spoke until the footman had withdrawn. Then Alina looked at the note and back at him. "You want to start again," she said. "I want to start," James said. "We never actually started." A silence. "There are 4 months left," Alina said carefully. "There are 4 months left on the clause," James said. "There is no limit on anything else." Alina looked at him. He looked back. "That is either very brave or very foolish," she said quietly. Almost exactly what Mr. Hale had said to her. He would learn later, on a Tuesday morning in his narrow office, when she had placed a copied contract on his desk and asked if it could be done. "Can it be both?" James said. Alina was quiet for a long moment. Then, for the first time since the morning she had signed the marriage contract, Not the smile she had performed for the solicitor, not the pleasantness she had deployed like armor in room after room. She smiled at him. Small, unguarded, real. "It can be both," she said. "The 4 months passed differently than the first two." Not dramatically differently. There was no sudden transformation. No morning where James woke up a changed man and Alina woke up a different woman. They were both too old for that, too formed, too accustomed to their own particular shapes. But the quality of the time changed. The texture of it changed. Days that had previously passed with the bland, managed efficiency of an arrangement became days that had weight and color and occasionally, unexpectedly, humor. They had breakfast together. This was the first thing, and it was small, but it was not nothing. James had always taken breakfast early, alone, in the habit of a man who considered the first hour of the day a working hour and not a social one. Alina, he discovered, was also an early riser. She had simply been taking her breakfast in her rooms, because no one had told her otherwise and she had not wanted to impose. The morning he found her in the corridor at 7 o'clock, heading toward the east staircase with a book under her arm, he had said without premeditation, "The breakfast room is warmer." She had looked at him for a moment. Then she had followed him downstairs. After that, they had breakfast together every morning. They did not always talk. Sometimes Alina read and James worked through correspondence, and the room held the comfortable silence of two people who did not need to fill space with noise. Sometimes they talked about the estate, about the tenants, about something Alina had read or something James had heard in the city. Once, for nearly 40 minutes, about the correct interpretation of a passage in Gibbon, which ended without resolution, and with both of them slightly flushed and more animated than either had intended to be over a footnote from the 18th century. Mrs. Harding observed all of this with the impassive thoroughness of a woman who had run large households long enough to understand that the atmosphere of a house lived in its details, and that the details at Ashford Manor were changing. She mentioned none of this to anyone, but she did, one afternoon, rearrange the flowers in the east corridor so that they were visible from the library window. Small things, but the days were built of small things. James took Alina to the opera in January. Not because it was required, there was no social obligation attached, no audience to perform for. He had 2 tickets, a standing arrangement he had largely been ignoring since the previous spring, and he had knocked on the library door on a Tuesday evening and asked, with slightly less ease than he would have liked, whether she would like to come. Alina had looked up from her book. "Yes," she said, simply, without qualification. Then she looked back at her book and turned the page, and James had the distinct impression that she was concealing something, not duplicity, nothing like that, just a thing she did not want him to see in her face in that moment. He went back to his study and sat down and thought about what that thing might be. He was fairly certain he knew. The opera was Bellini. Alina sat beside him in the Ashford box and watched the stage with an absorption so complete that she seemed to briefly forget he was there. And James, who had attended the opera dutifully for 15 years without it ever producing anything resembling feeling, found himself watching her instead. Her face in the lamplight of the theater did something extraordinary during the second act. Something moved through it, some response to the music that she was not managing or measuring, because she had forgotten in this unguarded hour to manage and measure. He saw her throat move. He saw her press her lips together once, very briefly, in the way of someone maintaining composure against something that is pulling at it. He looked away, back at the stage. After a moment, very quietly, he moved his hand on the armrest between them, not reaching, just present, and offering as low risk as he could make it. Alina's hand moved too. Their fingers touched, stayed. On the stage, the soprano's voice climbed toward something impossible and reached it, and James Calloway sat very still and felt the warmth of Alina's hand against his and thought, with a clarity that arrived without drama or fanfare, simply as fact. I do not want her to leave. Not in the abstract, not as a practical concern, not as anything to do with the contract or the clause or the careful legal architecture Alina had built around her own exit. He simply, entirely, did not want her to go. He did not say this. Not that night, not the following week, not in February when the anniversary of the contract signing came and went without either of them acknowledging it, which meant they had now been married for 4 months, and that 2 remained on the clock Alina had set. He did not say it because he was, in this specific arena, genuinely uncertain not of what he felt but of what she felt, and Alina was, for all that she had become legible to him in so many ways, still capable of surprising him. He knew she was not indifferent. He was not a fool, and Alina was not a woman who performed warmth she did not feel. The breakfasts, the evenings in the library, the opera, the way she laughed at things he said with the unguarded delight of someone who had not expected to be amused, none of that was performance. He knew the difference between Alina performing and Alina being, because he had seen both, and they were nothing alike. But knowing she was not indifferent was not the same as knowing what she wanted to do at the end of 6 months, and he was not willing to ask. Asking felt, for reasons he examined and could not entirely rationalize, like applying pressure to something that needed to make its own decision. Alina had built herself a door. What that door meant was hers to determine, so he said nothing. He had breakfast with her every morning. He worked beside her in the library in the evenings. He took her driving on Sundays when the weather permitted, and they argued companionably about whatever presented itself as argument, worthy, which was, he was discovering, a considerable range of subjects. He learned that she had been teaching herself Italian from a grammar book she kept on her nightstand. He learned that she disliked roses but was passionate about snowdrops. He learned that she had a talent for mimicry that she deployed rarely and devastatingly, and that the impression she did of his solicitor, produced once and only once during a particularly tedious dinner with estate agents, had nearly caused him to lose his composure entirely in a room full of people who would have found it very interesting. He learned her. And he said nothing because the clock was running and Alina would make her choice, and he had decided with some difficulty, with the particular effort of a man who was not accustomed to accepting outcomes he could not control, that it had to be hers. March arrived cold and sharp. With it came a letter from Mr. Hale. James saw it arrive. He recognized the handwriting now, recognized the paper, recognized the quiet, unhurried efficiency of the boy who delivered it to the garden path on Wednesday mornings. He said nothing. He was in the upstairs study, and Alina was in the garden, and she took the letter and put it in her pocket and continued her walk. And James watched from the window and felt something cold settle in his chest that he recognized as fear. Not the fear of losing property or reputation or any of the things he had spent his adult life carefully protecting. A different fear, smaller in some ways and larger in others. The fear of a man who has realized, later than he should have, that the most significant thing in his daily life arrived in a carriage on a gray afternoon, and signed a piece of paper with a steady hand and a plan he had been too arrogant to see coming. He went back to his desk. He did not work particularly well that morning. That evening, Alina did not come to the library. James sat at his usual chair with his usual book and read the same page 4 times and retained nothing. At 9 o'clock he closed the book. At 9:30, he walked to the window and looked out at the dark grounds and thought about nothing in particular with great intensity. At 10 o'clock there was a knock at the library door. "Come in," he said. Alina opened the door. She was still dressed. She had not yet gone upstairs, which meant she had been somewhere in the house for the past 3 hours without his being aware of it. She was holding something. He could not see what it was. She came into the room and stopped a few feet from him. "Mr. Hale wrote," she said. "I know." She looked at him, then she looked at the thing in her hand. It was a document. Small, folded, official. He could see the clean edges of legal paper, the weight of it in her hand. "The 6 months are in 9 days, she said. "Yes." He sent the papers. She held the document with a steadiness that cost her something. He could see it, the effort of it, the careful maintenance. The dissolution papers. If I sign, it's done. The financial provisions trigger. My father's debts are settled. I'm free. The word free landed in the quiet room like a stone into still water. James said nothing. I've been sitting with it for 3 hours, Alina said. Her voice was even. Her voice was always even. But he knew her now. He knew the register underneath the evenness, the place where the thing she was actually feeling lived. In my rooms, just sitting. And James said. She looked at him. In the firelight of the library, in the quiet of the house, they had somehow, without either of them officially deciding to, made into a home. Alina Voss looked at her husband with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not the composure, not the pleasantness, not the careful management of a woman who had learned to protect herself by giving nothing away. Just her. I don't want to sign it, she said. The words were very quiet. They landed in the room and stayed. James looked at her for a moment. Then he crossed the distance between them, not quickly, not dramatically, simply directly, the way he moved toward things he had decided, and took the document from her hand. He held it for a moment, looked at it. Then he walked to the fireplace and held it to the flame. Alina made a small sound, not a protest exactly, something more complicated than that. James, you can have Mr. Hale draft new ones tomorrow, he said, watching the paper catch, if you change your mind. The document burned cleanly. He dropped the last corner into the grate. He turned back to her. Alina was looking at him with the expression he had seen briefly in flashes over the past months, the unguarded one, the one that was simply her, but sustained now, undefended. I won't change my mind, she said. No, James said, I didn't think you would. She exhaled. It was a very small sound, barely audible, barely anything. But it was the sound of something she had been holding for a long time finally being set down. He offered his hand. Not dramatically, not with any speech attached, simply his hand open in the space between them. Alina looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she placed her hand in his and the matter was settled. They stood there for a moment in the firelight, neither of them speaking, both of them, for once, entirely without plans. You knew, Alina said after a while. These past weeks, you knew I was deciding. Yes. You didn't say anything. No, she was quiet. Why? James looked at their joined hands. Because it had to be yours, he said. I wasn't willing to, he paused, finding the right language for something he had not put into words before. You built yourself a door. What you chose to do with it was yours. I didn't want to be another person standing between you and your own decision. Alina was very still. No one, she said quietly, has ever said anything like that to me. I know, James said. She looked up at him, he looked back. I read the ledgers, she said after a moment, with the air of someone who has decided that if things are going to be honest, they may as well be completely honest. Before I had any intention of staying, I found the discrepancy and I didn't know what to do with it because I was planning to leave and it seemed important to you, to the estate. So I kept the notes. In case. In case you stayed, James said. In case someone needed to know. He considered this. You were going to tell me even if you left. I wasn't sure, Alina said, but probably yes. James was quiet for a moment. Then, that is either very brave or very foolish. Alina's expression shifted. A flicker of something, recognition, warmth, the particular quality of amusement that arrived in her eyes before it reached her mouth. Can it be both, she said. It can be both, James said. She smiled, and he understood, looking at her smile in the firelight of the library where they had spent their best evenings, that he was going to be seeing this expression for the rest of his life, and that the rest of his life was going to be considerably less manageable and considerably more worthwhile than anything he had previously arranged for himself. He was not afraid of that. He was, in fact, looking forward to it. Outside the library windows, the March night pressed dark and cold against the glass. Inside, the fire burned. And in the grate, the last ash of Mr. Hale's dissolution papers cooled to nothing, which was exactly what they deserved. 1 year later, the letter arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor was in the library when Mrs. Harding brought it in at the desk by the window, the one she had claimed as her own sometime in the autumn, and which James had never once suggested she vacate, partly because he respected her claim and partly because the sight of her there, in the morning light with her books and her correspondence and her Italian grammar, had become one of the fixed points of his day. She looked at the letter, set down her pen. It was from her father. Lord Voss had written to her 4 times in the past year. The first letter had arrived 3 weeks after the dissolution papers burned, which meant someone had told him they had burned Mr. Hale, she supposed, fulfilling some professional obligation she had not anticipated. The letter had been brief and carefully worded, the letter of a man who understood that he had done something that required acknowledgement but was not entirely certain how to acknowledge it without diminishing himself. He was glad, he wrote, that she was settled. He hoped Ashford suited her. He remained, as always, her devoted father. Eleanor had read it twice and put it in a drawer. The second and third letters had been similar, warmer, perhaps, more willing to approach the edges of what had actually happened without quite arriving there. She had answered both, briefly, pleasantly, the way you answered letters from people you were still deciding what to do with. The fourth letter was different. She could feel it from the weight of it, from the way it sat in her hand. She opened it. Her father wrote this time without carefulness, without the managed language of a man protecting his own dignity. He wrote, and Eleanor read this slowly twice, then a third time, that he was sorry. Not for the debt, not for the circumstances, but for the morning in the solicitor's office, for the touch on her elbow, for the word smile communicated through the pressure of his hand on her arm when she had needed, and deserved, something entirely different. He wrote that he had not understood until recently what it had cost her. He wrote that he was glad she was well. He wrote that he was proud of her, and that the pride sat uncomfortably, because he knew he had not earned the right to it, but that it was true regardless. He wrote, your mother would have liked him. She would have liked what you've built. Eleanor sat for a long time with the letter in her hands. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the desk drawer, not with the first 3 letters, but separately in a different compartment, a different category. She picked up her pen. She began to write back. She was still writing when James came in. He did not knock. They had passed the point of knocking sometime in November, when it had become apparent that the library was as much his room as hers, and the knocking had started to feel like a formality neither of them required. He came in with the particular quality of movement he had on mornings when the estate business had given him something to think about, slightly distracted, slightly purposeful, the look of a man carrying a problem he has not yet solved. He stopped when he saw her face. Not obviously. He was still in many ways a controlled man. He did not exclaim or rush toward her or ask with visible alarm whether she was all right. But he stopped, and he looked at her, and the distracted quality left him entirely. My father wrote, Eleanor said. James came to the desk. He did not read over her shoulder. She would have turned the letter toward him if she wanted him to read it, and he knew this, and she knew that he knew this. He simply came and stood near her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and waited. He apologized, Eleanor said, properly, a silence. How do you feel? James said. Eleanor considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Outside the library windows, the spring morning was progressing, pale sunshine, the first real warmth of the year, the grounds of Ashford Manor coming back into green after the long gray of winter. From somewhere near the stables, she could hear one of the grooms talking to a horse in the unhurried way of men who trusted animals more than people. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I think I'm glad he wrote it. James nodded. He pulled the other chair to the desk and sat down, not across from her but beside her, the way he did when they were working through something together. "Right back," he said. "You'll know more once you do." Eleanor looked at him. He was watching her with the expression she had come to know as his most unguarded one. The one that appeared in private, in rooms where there was no one to be managed or impressed. The one that had taken her 4 months to see the first time and that she now saw regularly, freely, without effort, because James Calloway had turned out to be, underneath the cold efficiency and the carved stone expression, and the desk he had not looked up from the morning she signed away her future. A man of considerable feeling who had simply, for a long time, not found anyone worth the risk of showing it. She had apparently been worth the risk. She was still getting used to that. She suspected she would be getting used to it for some time. "Yes," she said, "I will." She turned back to the letter. James picked up a book from the corner of the desk. Her Italian grammar, as it happened, which he had begun consulting with what he described as idle curiosity and what she recognized as determined effort, because James Calloway did not do anything idly. He turned to a page near the middle, frowned at it slightly, and settled in. They sat together in the morning light, the spring coming in at the windows, the house quiet around them. Eleanor wrote. She finished the letter an hour later. It was not long. It was not the letter of a daughter who had forgotten or a daughter who was pretending. It was the letter of a woman who was choosing, carefully and with full knowledge of what she was choosing, to leave a door open, not to rush through it, not to stand in the doorway and wait for something she was no longer sure she needed. Just to leave it open because she was, it turned out, capable of that now in a way she had not been a year ago. She read it through once, folded it. James looked up from the Italian grammar. "Done." "Done," she said. He looked at her for a moment, reading her face in the quick, accurate way he had. He had become, over the course of a year, startlingly good at reading her face, which she found alternately comforting and inconvenient. "Better," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. She set the letter aside to be posted. "Better." He nodded, looked back at the grammar, frowned again. "What is the difference," he said, "between Esser and stare?" Eleanor looked at the ceiling briefly. "James, it seems arbitrary." "It is not arbitrary. I've explained it twice." "Explain it a third time." "You are doing this deliberately." "I am doing this," he said, with perfect composure, "because I am attempting to learn Italian and you are the only person in this house who speaks it. I am the only person in this house who is learning it. There is a distinction. A narrow one." She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was almost, not quite. James Calloway was not a man who deployed innocence easily, almost innocent. Eleanor pressed her lips together. "Esser," she said, "is for permanent states, what something is. Stare is for temporary states, how something is at a given moment." James considered this. "Give me an example." "Sono felice," Eleanor said. "I am happy. That is Esser, because it is." She paused, and something happened in her expression that she did not entirely manage, a softening, a small, unguarded warmth. "Because it is a state of being, not a moment, a state." James was quiet. He was looking at her in the way he sometimes looked at her, not the assessing look, not the thoughtful look, but the other one. The one she had first seen in the doorway of Lady Pemberton's dining room, and that had not, in a year, stopped producing the same effect. "Sono felice," he repeated, quietly, carefully. "Your pronunciation is appalling," Eleanor said. "Say it again," James said. "I'll improve." She looked at him for a moment. Then she smiled, the small, unguarded one, the one that had made its first appearance on a March morning in the breakfast room, and that belonged, she had long since accepted, entirely to him. "Sono felice," she said. Outside, the spring morning continued its unhurried progress. Somewhere in the garden, the first snowdrops of the year were doing what snowdrops did, appearing without announcement, without drama, in the cold and the pale light, small and white and entirely certain of themselves. Inside the library, Alina Voss, Alina Calloway, picked up her Italian grammar, found the relevant page, and handed it across the desk to her husband, who took it and did not let go of her hand. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Tell us which city you're watching from in the comments. Reading them honestly makes our day. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more period drama stories. And if you'd like to support the channel even more, you can also join as a member.